Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Eric Johansson, a teacher with LSAT Demon. With me is Nathan Fox, co-founder of LSATdemon.com and the weekly podcast Thinking LSAT. Today, an email from Grant. The subject is it common for LSAT Demon students to have a large initial score improvement, then slower progress thereafter?
Wow, that's a well-written subject line that basically says the whole email just right there in the subject. But I'll read Grant's email anyway. Hi, I am so grateful to have stumbled upon LSAT Demon as my first and only LSAT prep method. Nice. In just 1 week of using it, I have increased my score on practice tests by 12 points from my diagnostic score of 152 last week to 165 today. I still have a long way to go to reach my goal score, but I'm encouraged by this initial progress. Okay, first of all, with the diagnostic of 152, I'm not surprised at all that you made huge, immediate improvement. Because if you can score a 152, it means that you are capable of solving questions. Then it just becomes a matter of, okay, stop trying to solve so many of them, solve fewer of them, but solve all of the ones that you waste time on or spend time on. Stop wasting your time by missing questions and instead only do questions with the intention of fully doing each question, solving it before you move on to the next one. Just that by itself will take you from a cold diagnostic of 152 into the 160s. And so I'm not surprised at all that that happened in a week, especially because Grant doesn't have to unlearn a bunch of stupid question type nonsense or read the question first or diagramming, outlining, highlighting, note taking, any of that bullshit. If you're not weighed down by all that, and I say this all the time. So Grant, I know you're going to ask about progress and rates of progress and all that, but what I want to tell you right off the bat is you should insist on ending up in the mid 170s, no lower, on your official LSAT. If you have a diagnostic of 152, you study with us, and especially based on the quick, immediate progress that you've made, I have no doubt, Grant, that you're going to go from the low 150s into the mid 170s eventually. I have no doubt that that's going to happen for you. So that's very good news for Grant. Grant is in an amazing spot. Whether it's going to happen this week, this month, 3 months from now, I don't know. But I think you're going to continue to make progress. And I'm certain that if you just refuse anything less than a 170, you're going to do it. You're going to get there. So awesome.
Yep.
Grant continues. I've heard Ben and Nathan say on podcast episodes that improvement on the LSAT isn't always linear, but I wonder if you have noticed any other patterns in student score improvement. For example, is it common to see this large initial score improvement like mine, then slower growth from there? Of course, I won't allow your answer to necessarily become my own fate. I'm just curious, smiley face. Grant.
I think that's a fairly common pattern in many endeavors. When you start learning something new or you start practicing something new, there is often a beginner's bump, like an initial sharp increase in your ability, and then it kind of tapers off and
I think
as you reach a higher level of expertise, but that's not always the case for the LSAT. And in fact, sometimes we see people who really stagnate early on, maybe because of some of the bad advice they get about how to do the LSAT, and then someone else comes along and shifts their approach to the test, and they're like, oh crap, and then suddenly there's a spike later in the study. So it's different based on different circumstances.
Yeah. But there's the law of diminishing returns. You have gotten wild early gains. By the way, Grant did the math wrong. 152 to 165 is a 13-point improvement, not a 12-point improvement. But 13 points in a week.
I'm forgetting now. Grant sent a PS correcting that mistake, and I forgot to include that correction.
Nice. No, good,
so,
good.
Yeah.
I'm glad. So Grant is vindicated. But that 13-point improvement, I would pretty much guarantee you're not going to make another 13-point improvement in one more week of prep. And you then certainly would not make another 13-point improvement beyond that, because
that would be impossible.
You're already at the top of the scale. So yeah, dude, you've made amazing initial gains. By the way, that 165 is just one data point. So you should expect Like if your next practice test is a 158, I'm not going to be surprised at all. You just got to keep going. And the random number generator every practice test is going to spit out a different number. On average, they're going to be going up. How fast they go up, at what rate, it's not a continuous or like a linear thing at all, as I've already talked about apparently on the show. You know that. Um, is it common to see big initial gains and then slower progress? Yes, but I don't think that's anything special about LSAT prep. That's just diminishing returns, especially as you get closer to the top of the scale. I mean, I think sometimes maybe the opposite of that happens when people start in the 120s. It's like, well, it could be a big grind for them to get from 129 to 135, but then it's possible that after some weeks or months, then eventually it like really registers with them that they have to slow down even more than they thought, and they have to really devote themselves to actually understanding every sentence, and they might have to let go of the idea that they're ever going to finish the sections. And I mean, which you certainly should if you're at that level. And then all of a sudden you could spring from 135 to 150 kind of overnight, 3 months into your prep, if you made a fundamental change where you were like, oh, I thought they were just bullshitting when they said that I should focus only on accuracy, not on speed at all. And then, okay, well, you're not going to make progress if you think I'm lying. But sometimes we have to say it to you a half a dozen or dozen more times, and then finally it registers. And then when you get that click, oh, wait, that's all that's going on here? They're just asking me to pick the answer that's proven by the facts? Well, then it's this. Yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell you. If you would have just read the facts more carefully in the first place and read the question that they were asking you, which clearly says which one must be true based on those facts, you would realize that the test is so easy that it's just, no, there's one answer there that's actually proven by those facts, and there's 4 answers that are not proven by those facts, and you can figure that out. And that's where people sometimes go from, like I said, 135 to 150 overnight once they see that, they get that like realization.
Yeah, and there are tons of little clicks like that that can happen. Like if you reach a point where like for whatever reason something just really clicks in for you about, oh, sufficient versus necessary. I think I get it now.
Yeah.
That one realization.
That's a 135 to a 145. Or like for someone who's at Grant's current level, realizing the difference between a necessary assumption question and a sufficient assumption question, which there are a lot of both types on the LSAT, and you can get to 165 without knowing the difference, but it's real hard to get from there to 172 without knowing the difference. And so that's the kind of thing that might give Grant, like Grant could easily stagnate in the low to mid 160s for a while. And there might then be future breakthroughs 6 weeks, 12 weeks down the road where that next like piece kind of clicks into focus.
Yeah.
And then he makes another big jump.
The other thing that I have heard of happening is people taking breaks and coming back and suddenly seeing a jump after a break.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people who feel stuck might be experiencing some kind of burnout, or they're just spinning their wheels and they're not really learning from their mistakes. They're not consolidating their lessons in their head, and
they're not being natural and intuitive anymore. They're controlling the process too much. So I know it's a weird balance because I'm always talking about how careful you have to be and how you have to really understand everything you read. But, and I mean all that, but what happens with students, I think, is that they get so caught up in all the lessons and nomenclature and labeling things. And it's like me when I play too much golf and I like lose the plot entirely because I'm trying to control fine motor function that can't be controlled. And it's like, no, dude, you've been playing golf since you were 10. You need to make a couple smooth practice swings and you need to get up there and just let it rip because you can't control it anyway.
Yeah.
And when I don't play for a while, I go out and I hit the ball beautifully. I mean, not that beautifully because I'm not that good of a golfer, but I hit it good for me when I haven't played at all for like 2 months, I just go, I'm like, oh shit, all I'm trying to do is make contact. Like I want to not fall down and I want to make good contact here. I'm going to keep my head still and I'm just going to kind of take a swing, and see what happens. And it's like, oh yeah, well, you've got a pretty good golf swing because you played since you were a kid. So like, it's not that hard. And that's the only way to be good at golf, is to feel like it's not that hard. But if I play a lot, then golf reminds me that it's hard, especially when I try to overly control it. And that is what happens with students when they get too technical about it. They've done too much and they feel like they've stagnated, they've plateaued or whatever. Yeah, okay. How about you take 4 or 5 days off?
Yeah. I struggle with that as a teacher. I'm sure you experience this as well. Getting very good questions from students in class. Say we're doing a reading comp passage, and I will have finished reading something or gotten through a paragraph and have identified what I think the main point is, and someone
Yep.
will ask a question really digging into, well, how did you read that in that way that you understood it? Because it's very complicated. And how did you identify that that was the main point? Because I'm looking at these pieces and I don't see it coming together.
Yep.
And I can explain usually fairly well what my brain did to read that and to understand it. Or I can describe some of the processes that I will implement in order to break down a sentence that's confusing, like to
Yep.
reword something in a way that makes sense for me. Just
Yep.
reading comp skills, I can describe that, but the act of describing it makes it sound like more of a conscious act than it really is. So I will be describing to students, well, this is the stuff that you can think about. And like, these are the steps for how you can break down and simplify a complicated sentence. And here are some of the clues for what this main point is here and how the author signals it. But I'm not really thinking about that consciously when I'm reading. So describing the process has a way of making it seem like that's something you should really be focusing on, when in fact it's something you just need to practice and drill into yourself so it becomes natural. It's tricky to teach.
Articulating the process, yeah, like I think well, what we know about the way the brain works, like you're telling yourself stories all the time to explain behaviors that might have just been controlled by non-rational parts of your brain at all. Like, no, like
Yeah.
it could have, no, that was your gut that made that decision. Like you just felt like doing that. And then, oh, that's because I was watching Food Network last night with my wife and we saw that thing about bundt cakes. And that's why I went, nah, yeah, okay. Like, sure, you're rationalizing it now as that's what happened. But that's because of like this observer paradox, right? Where you're, now that you're like talking about it, you're creating a case for how it went down, but how it really went down was a different process. On to take it back to the LSAT, when I'm reacting to an argument, well, when I'm reacting to a passage, first of all, I'm reacting one sentence at a time. And I'm just looking to call bullshit. But sometimes they just give me one fact about parrots, and then they give me another fact about parrots, and then they give me another fact about parrots. And I get to the end of that and I go, well, what about it? It's just a bunch of facts about parrots. And so then, okay, there's not really an argument there. Okay, could I connect those facts about parrots? By the way, if I could have connected the facts about parrots, I would have been making those connections as I go. So then it's like, if there is an argument, I was just talking about this on, I think it was on Thinking LSAT with Ben, just talking about like, well, so there's a few different reactions. One, there's no argument at all. Two, there's an argument that it's valid. Oh, I see what you did here. You're trying to conclude this, and your facts actually prove that. Another reaction is, okay, that's a flawed argument. Like you did something just objection. Like I see how stupid this is, and I'm going to tell you exactly what you did wrong. So I'm reacting to a flawed argument. Other times, it's more like, yeah, okay, I see what you're trying to prove here, and it could be that that's how it works, but I can also give you credit for your evidence without giving you credit for your conclusion.
Yeah. If I had you in the room with me, I would ask you some questions about this.
Yeah, exactly. What about this? What about that? What about this other thing? I'm not saying that your conclusion is false, and I'm not saying that your argument is flawed. I'm just asking some questions. So there's really 4 different reactions when I read the passage. This is all before I get to the question and, God forbid, the answer choices. There's kind of 4 different ways that I can react to a passage. So again, 1, it's just a set of facts. And if I see a set of facts, probably there's a connection between those facts that they're going to then test me on. 2, I see a valid argument where I go, oh, wow, okay, they actually did it this time. I know that on about 10% of the arguments that you're going to see on the LSAT, they actually do it. They actually prove their conclusion. And you have to notice that because you have to be trying to call bullshit. But if you see, oh, well, nah, if that's their evidence and that's their conclusion, then it's game over. Like they already won. Or I spot a flawed argument. I'll tell you exactly why it's flawed. Or I see an argument that's just, well, it's incomplete. Like, I'm going to have to ask you some questions about that. Could be, but I'm going to ask you some questions. So 4 different reactions. But that all happens pretty naturally as an outgrowth of just understanding one sentence at a time. We read an email on Thinking LSAT where somebody was like, their process was like, first, I'm going to label the premises and the conclusion. Then I'm going to label who's speaking. Then I'm going to point out the gaps. Wait a second. Was there even an argument there? Were they making an argument? Because if they weren't making an argument, then there's no point pointing out the gaps. And by gaps, what do you mean by that? Are you talking about a flawed argument? Maybe there are no gaps. Maybe the conclusion is proven, in which case you can't point out the gaps. Now, if you're saying there's gaps, what do you really mean by that? Do you mean that the argument is flawed? Like there's problems with the argument? They did something dumb? Or do you just mean that the argument is incomplete? In which case, maybe those facts could be used to support that conclusion, but you're going to have to ask them some questions to figure it out. That probably doesn't simplify things in the minds of students, right? This is why you're saying it's hard to teach.
This is right, because when you try to talk about it, it makes it sound more complicated than it really is. Because you've given like, because somewhere some listener is now writing down, these are the 4 different categories of reaction that you can have at the end of reading a LR passage. And it's not really about having that list.
And by the way, this happens sentence by sentence. You don't just wait till the end of it all. So you make sure you understand each piece first, then start trying to put and you are connecting the pieces as you go, but then thinking about the totality of the record. Is there even an argument? Or is it just a set of facts? If there is an argument, it can be either a valid argument, it can be a flawed argument, or it can just be an argument where you're like, I'm not so sure. It depends on other factors. And that's, yeah, the way I experience it in real time is kind of like a vibe check, right? I'm reading that passage. I'm looking for them to do something stupid. But if they just present me a bunch of facts, I can't say that's stupid. And if they present me a valid argument, I can't say that's stupid. And if they present me an argument that's just incomplete, I would go, well, that could be stupid or it could be really smart. It depends. Let me ask you some questions. Or they could present actually an argument that's flawed. And so I think one thing that people do is they get way caught up on, I have to find the flaw. Well, okay, is there even an argument? And then is there a flaw?
Yeah.
Or is it just like you're not quite sure because more information needed?
I think at the end of the day, it kind of comes back to treating these LSAT questions a little less like questions on the LSAT and a little more like just stuff that you're reading.
Right.
Stuff that somebody is telling you.
Yeah. So, right. And what I would ask tutoring students, right, I would have them read a sentence or two, or maybe even the whole passage. But I frequently would stop them after just a sentence or two. And I would say, how do you feel about that? And that would be a real good, I could tell a lot by how they reacted. Because there are a lot of students who say, that's bullshit. And I go, why? And they have no idea. Like if you can't tell me why,
because you
it's
told me
bullshit.
to call them out on their bullshit.
Right. Like, no, that's just trying to get the treat. Like you're not, you don't really understand what's happening. That's just.
I'm picturing you with one of those like dog trainer hip bags with the little treats inside. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're not demonstrating any real understanding by just saying that's bullshit. If you can't tell me why it's bullshit, you don't have any clue. Where was I going with that?
You had students stop and react.
Oh, right. And so that you should tell me, like, I would try to stop students at the point where they made a conclusion, or they had made a conclusion and then presented some evidence that was, either really good evidence or questionable evidence or outright flawed in their thinking, and I'd stop. Okay, so what do you think about that? And then you've got to be able to tell me at that point, like, is there an argument? Are they doing logic here? If they're doing logic, what's the evidence? What's the conclusion? Yeah. But how do you feel about it? Is it good, or is it bad, or is it unknown? And you should have some thoughts as you're reading. When you do that, you'll learn that you are going to predict the answer to the question, no matter what the question even asks you. You're going to frequently predict the answer to the question, like half the time or more on logical reasoning. You're going to know what the answer is probably about before you even read the question, let alone any of the answer choices, because you're just dominating the record.
And those feelings, those reactions, they don't have to be the reactions of an LSAT student. They should be the reactions of you, the person.
They don't have to include the words necessary assumption if that's what you're worried about, or they don't have to always refer to conditional logic. Sometimes, like, people will be like, because they're trying, it's like they're Chat GPT, and they're just like trying to parrot words that seem like they would be part of a good explanation. I'm like, how do you feel about that? And they're like, well, the sufficient condition is this and the necessary condition is that. And I'm like, what? I didn't ask you for a technical analysis. I asked you what you thought of that. And what I mean by what you think of that is, like, what do they want? I mean, do they even want anything? Or is it just a bunch of facts? If they do want something, that's their conclusion. Why do they want it? What's the evidence that they're presenting to try to get that thing? And then, are they doing a good job? Are they doing a bad job? Or are they doing an incomplete job? And that's not like LSAT speak. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to say premise. You don't have to say conclusion. You never have to say intermediate conclusion.
Ugh.
Right? It's much more of like a natural process where it's an outgrowth of simply understanding the things that you're saying, that you're reading. When you understand what's there, you should have some thoughts. I don't know. That's not even related to Grant's email anymore, nor is it probably helpful. But if people are still listening at this point, I guess maybe they're finding it useful to some extent.
Yeah. Yeah, if they're still listening, then they are true LSAT Team and Daily Sickos, and we thank them for their service.
Or they just can't find the skip button on their podcast player, which is also possible.
Yeah, thank goodness for unintuitive UI.
Yeah, thank you for your support. The algorithm appreciates you just listening to the end, no matter what.
Thank you, Grant. Hopefully that was helpful. Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you'd like to ask us a question or share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.